So even though the 2024 presidential election is some 642 days away, we already have some big names throwing their hat in the ring and deciding to get involved in the presidential contest. So obviously, we had Donald Trump throw his name in back in November of last year. And now, of course, we have the first major big name Republican challenging Donald Trump, and that is Nikki Haley, set to announce her run February 15th. At least that's the date that's been floating around. And of course, there's a number of other Republicans that are expected to get involved in this race. And 2024 is going to be a competitive Republican primary, the first competitive Republican primary since 2016. So we've got a lot to cover over the next 2 years or so as we get into the primary season, as we get to the presidential election. And ultimately in this video, we're going to be looking at what Nikki Haley's chances are at the Republican nomination and how she'd perform in a general election environment. So of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider liking this video down below and subscribing if you're new. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So Nikki Haley is the former governor of South Carolina. She was also the UN ambassador under the Donald Trump administration. Her announcement really isn't much of a shock considering the fact that she has been mulling a run for president over the last year or so, and she's had really conflicting messaging on whether or not she was actually going to run or not. Originally, she said if Donald Trump was running for president again, that she wouldn't throw her name in, and of course now she's backtracked on that. And there's a number of other non-Trump candidates that are expected to jump in. Ron DeSantis, Larry Hogan, Mike Pompeo, maybe even Chris Sununu. So there's other big names as well that are going to throw their hat in the ring. And ultimately, this is something at this point in time that Donald Trump is encouraging, mainly because he knows that a divided field against him leaves a clear path to the nomination. Because remember, back in 2016, Donald Trump did not win the majority of Republican votes. I believe he only got 45% of the Republican primary vote. The reason Donald Trump won the 2016 primary was because the field against him was very divided. And that's something he's counting on this time around, especially since in the 24 primary, he's in a much weaker position than he was in 2016 and especially 2020. So looking at Nikki Haley's odds, obviously if we look at her electoral history, she performed as a pretty average Republican in South Carolina back in 2010 when South Carolina still had a lot of ancestral Democrats. She beat her Democratic opponent by about 5 points or so. And then of course if we go to 2014, she won by a much larger margin. Of course, this is off of the back of the red wave in 2014. Now, Nikki Haley didn't become a really big name in Republican politics until the Charleston massacre in 2015, in which she sort of demonstrated her leadership abilities and her ability to kind of bring the community together. And this ultimately shot her into the national spotlight. And of course, her running for president in 2016 probably would have been a very bad look, especially since a tragedy like that had just occurred. It would be seen as her exploiting it. And ultimately, she wanted to fulfill the rest of her term as governor, at least back then before she took the UN position. So she's been well known in Republican circles for quite a while now. Now, looking ahead at 2024, there's a number of big names already in the polling. Obviously, Donald Trump still has the lead in the primary polls, although there are some polls that have Ron DeSantis leading him. But on average, Donald Trump is still the favorite by about 16 points, according to RCP. But there's a number of other names on here. Nikki Haley consistently polls at 4%, 5%. She's polling much lower than somebody like Mike Pence or in some cases even Ted Cruz. But these polls don't really include all the possible candidates that we could see coming out of the Republican field. Again, Larry Hogan, Chris Sununu, other smaller names. Some have speculated that Glenn Youngkin is going to run for president, and I'll make a separate video on that because I think the answer to that is a little bit complicated because on the surface, it seems like he would, given his national profile, winning the Virginia gubernatorial race back in 21 and, of course, being such a well-known Republican at this point. But I think the answer to whether or not he runs or not is a little bit more complicated than that. But Nikki Haley herself, ideologically, is more in the establishment neoconservative category when talking about Republicans. She's much more akin to somebody like Mitt Romney or Marco Rubio than she is Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. So she clearly represents the more moderate, old-fashioned wing of the Republican Party in terms of policy. More interventionist foreign policy, still with the social conservatism, but with a more compassionate side. Whereas Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump are very much right-wing culture warriors, which is something that is very popular among the Republican base, but the Republicans have to expand outside their base in order to win national and statewide elections all across the country. So, given this about Nikki Haley, she would potentially have widespread appeal among suburban voters, at least in a general election. But in terms of a primary, when you've got big names like Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, even Mike Pence, I think Haley falls at a distant third or fourth. I think the only chance she has to win the nomination at this point in time is if all the non-Trump Republican candidates fall out of favor. If Ron DeSantis falls out of favor, Ted Cruz, if he decides to run, I don't think Ted Cruz is going to run, but Mike Pence, Larry Hogan, etc., if they all sort of collapse in on themselves, Haley would end up rising up and taking that anti-Trump vote in the Republican primary. Now, do I think something like that is very likely? No, but I think it's something that she's banking on, considering that's her only realistic chance at actually winning the nomination. She'd have to gobble up all of the anti-Trump vote throughout the primary process and get enough votes to ultimately end up winning at the convention. But as of right now, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it's very likely that Nikki Haley probably will stay at about a third or fourth place finisher and probably be overshadowed by Ron DeSantis or some other more popular Republican within the party. I don't think somebody like Liz Cheney or anything like that has any remote chance of running in the Republican primary, although they might try to run for president ultimately. Now, if we take a look at the national map, I think there's a number of states on here where Nikki Haley would perform better than other Republicans, mainly Trump and Ron DeSantis, because as I said before, Nikki Haley does have that more compassionate, moderate image than somebody like Ron DeSantis, and especially somebody like Donald Trump. So obviously, Nikki Haley being more of a Southern conservative, she's probably going to do better in a place like Georgia. Now, again, I'm not saying that means she's necessarily going to win, but I think she would be strongest in these places. Certainly a state like Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, I don't really necessarily think so. We'll leave that blank for now. Texas, I think Nikki Haley would probably be the strongest Republican in Texas just because she would stem a lot of the Republican bleeding in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Austin, she'd probably get some of those more independent and moderate voters who aren't really fans of Biden but see Nikki Haley as more of a stabilizing, competent, sort of centrist leader as opposed to a right-wing culture warrior like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. Arizona, certainly. I think Arizona is much more in favor of sort of the old guard neoconservative Republicans than sort of the new Trumpian brand that has sprung up in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, as evidenced by, the 2018, 2020, and 2022 elections, those types of Republicans have tended to fare very poorly in Arizona as opposed to the more standard average Republicans, somebody like Doug Ducey, Kimberly Yee. They do a lot better in Arizona. Another area where I think Nikki Haley would do very well, and it's not exactly a state, but it's Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, and that's mainly because of the fact that it's extremely suburban. And I think Nikki Haley, as I mentioned earlier, she's a conservative, but she has more of a compassionate side. So there's a number of things that I think go in her favor when sort of advertising herself in these suburbs. And I think ultimately a place like Nebraska's 2nd district would be an area that she could win, especially given the fact that she is much more towards the center than the other Republican candidates. But in terms of other states where I think Nikki Haley would have more of an advantage, that's probably where it ends. You could make an argument that she could potentially do better in Minnesota just because of the Minneapolis metro area, but I wouldn't say as a whole in the state, rather, that she would do better than one of the other Republican contenders, but it's really just limited to the Sun Belt, which is the area where she's from. Obviously, South Carolina should do better. I just put that as red because obviously she's going to win it by a pretty comfortable margin. Any Republican is going to win South Carolina by a comfortable margin. But in summary, the Sun Belt is where Nikki Haley is probably going to be strongest if she made it to the general election. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's very unlikely that Nikki Haley is the Republican nominee. I think it's really going to be a head-to-head contest between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And again, the one thing that would make that not the case is the scenario I mentioned earlier in which the non-Trump Republicans, somebody like Ron DeSantis or Chris Sununu, whoever these people are, they sort of collapse and Nikki Haley sort of rises up out of the ashes and sort of takes up all their delegates and votes and beats Donald Trump. Or if Donald Trump collapses, and then that sort of changes the entire dynamic of the Republican primary, because this whole primary is really fixated on, does the Republican Party want to stick with Donald Trump or does it want to move on to another alternative. And with Trump out of the picture, I think the primary would be totally different because you'd have a much more open field, and the Republican Party would probably be much more undecided. I think you'd have a lot of those Trump backers probably end up backing Ron DeSantis, and some of those former DeSantis supporters probably sticking with him. In that case, I think DeSantis would win the primary fairly easily with Trump out of the picture, since in a lot of polls, if Trump is out of the picture, DeSantis is leading the primary by a pretty wide amount. So anyway, this is something that we're going to be following throughout the next 2 years. We're going to be talking more about the primary, some of the specific elections that are coming up in 2023, the gubernatorial races, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, so stay tuned for those. But that's it for this video. Leave a thumbs up down below if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.